So the story that I chose for this project was Rumpelstiltskin by the Grimm Brothers. This was a story that I had kind of heard. I watched a horror movie about it when I was younger, but I never really knew the background story of Rumpelstiltskin, so I thought it'd be interesting to go over it. So if you're not familiar with this tale, it's a tale about a poor miller who wanted to impress the king. So he lies to the king and tells him that his daughter can spin straw into gold. So the king is kind of skeptical. He's impressed that, if she can do that, that can make him a lot of money, but he doesn't see how it'd be possible. So he decides, you know what, I'll put her to the test. If your daughter can really turn straw into gold, then I'll marry her and she'll become the queen. So the king takes the miller's daughter to his castle and puts her in a room full of straw and tells her, if you spin all this straw to gold by the morning, I'll marry you. So she gets kind of, obviously anxious and scared and starts crying because she knows she can't do this. And then a little goblin like creature walks in and tells her, I can turn all this into gold, but basically, like, what's in it for me? So she gives him a piece of her jewelry and he spins all the straw to gold. And the next morning, the king is impressed, but tells her, do it again. Let's see if it's true. Let's see if this was just, a coincidence. So the next day she does it again. He's impressed and he tells her to do it one more time. He puts her in a big room full of a lot of straw and tells her, if you can turn all this into gold, then in the morning I'll marry you and you'll become the queen. Now all out of gifts, the miller's daughter doesn't really know what to give Rumpelstiltskin, so he tells her, then when you become the queen and you have your first baby, promise me that I can have your first child and I'll complete the task for you. Out of desperation and thinking, when's that even gonna happen? The miller's daughter just promises off the baby, and Rumpelstiltskin turns the straw into gold. The next day, she marries the king. And then when she finally has her baby, Rumpelstiltskin comes back to collect, his debt. And the miller's daughter completely forgot about this deal that she made with the little goblin. Um, and she starts, getting worried. She's like, "No, please, like, don't take my baby. Please don't take my baby." And Rumpelstiltskin, he reasons with her, and he's like, "All right, cool. So I'll give you 3 days. If you figure out my name within 3 days, then the deal's off. You keep your baby, and I just go about my business." So she starts guessing random names. He's like, "No, no, 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 that's not my name." Finally, she sends out some of her messengers to try to help her because it's getting close to the third day, and she really doesn't want to give up her baby. And while going through the woods, they see this little man, dancing and singing, and they hear him singing his name. So they go back and they tell the queen, his name is Rumpelstiltskin. And when he comes back to collect the baby on the third day, she's like, "Oh, I know your name." And she tells, it's Rumpelstiltskin. He's like, "Well, how do you know my name?" And he gets all, angry and starts jumping around and he just stomps himself into the ground and splits himself in two and dies. The first thing I noticed about this story is that there's a lot of greed throughout the whole story. The miller is so desperate to impress the king that he's willing to, give him his daughter, knowing that she may very well be killed if she can't turn the straw into gold, just to impress her. I'm sorry, just to impress him. And then the king is just, he's so greedy with money that he just like sees all this gold. Like, he just sees dollar signs. So he's just like, all right, cool, I'll marry whoever as long as she could just give me all this gold. There's some greed shown by Rumpelstiltskin. He kind of sees that this girl is in, stuck between a rock and a hard place. Either, she got to turn all this straw to gold or she's going to die. So he kind of plays on her vulnerability there, and he's like, well, I can turn this into gold if you want, but what's in it for me? And then there's even some greed with the miller's daughter. She was really heavily dependent on Rumpelstiltskin to turn all the straw into gold for her. And then when he came back to collect the baby that she promised him, she's just like, "No, what are you talking about? This is my baby. What do you want my baby for?" So he did what he needed to do for her, and she just doesn't want to hold up her end of the bargain. So I'd seen a lot of greed throughout the whole story. So after reading the tale and comparing it to the movie that I had originally seen about Rumpelstiltskin, I was just curious, what was his motive? In both versions of the tale that I'm familiar with, his end goal seemed to be to take some woman's baby, her firstborn child, and I was just curious, what was it with the babies? Couldn't he just kind of fool a toddler into coming with him? He had all these magical abilities, couldn't he just create his own baby with his magical powers? So doing some reading and research, I found an article that somebody kind of broke it down, and they translated Rumpelstiltskin in Dutch it translates to like crumpled stock. So they believe that that was kind of symbolic of erectile dysfunction, and that's probably why he wanted to steal somebody's baby. He couldn't have a baby of his own, despite these magical abilities. He has all these powers, but he can't make a baby, so he had to steal one. So something else I noted while I was reading the Grimm brothers' version of Rumpelstiltskin is how the miller's daughter is just treated as property. She really had no say in whether she wanted to live with the king or she wanted to marry the king. But her father just saw her as like a pawn almost, where he can gain brownie points with the king if he lied and said that his daughter can, make the king all this money by turning straw into gold. This could say a lot about women's place in society at the time that the fairy tale was written. This fairy tale by the Grimm brothers was written in 1812. Obviously, at the time, women didn't really have much of a say in anything. It was kind of just like, you were just there to make babies and take care of the family. So the miller didn't really see her as anything valuable. So he just traded her off to the king. So the miller's daughter was just seen as property. Now, going back into the reason why I chose this fairy tale to analyze this semester, the movie Rumpelstiltskin from 1995, directed by David Irving. If you're not familiar with it, it's almost the same story, just retold for a more adult audience. It starts off with Rumpelstiltskin running through the woods holding a baby, and there's, an angry mob of villagers chasing him. While he's running, he's screaming, "She owes me the baby, she owes me the baby. I turned all her straw into gold. She owes me a baby, she promised me." A witch, kind of casts a spell on him and damns his soul into a jade stone, which is then thrown over a cliff into the ocean. Um, and then it fast forwards to present day, which was 1995. A pregnant woman loses her husband. He was a police officer. He was shot on the job while she was on the phone with him. And then it fast forwards to after she has the baby. She's depressed. Obviously, she's raising this baby by herself. So one of her friends tells her, you gotta get out the house, come with me to the store. So they go thrifting and they come across this like witch store or whatever, and they find the stone. And the woman behind the counter tells them, that's not for sale. Bob tries to warn her, don't buy that, don't buy that. It's an evil wishing stone. The lady's just like, oh, it's a wishing stone. I want it. It's beautiful. Now, when the woman gets home and puts it on her mantle, she's trying to arrange it nicely, and she comes across a picture of her deceased husband. And she grabs the picture and she's still holding the stone and she starts to cry. And she's like, oh, Russ, I wish you can be here. I wish you can meet our son. So a tear falls from her face, it falls right onto the stone, and she places it back on the mantle and walks away. The stone starts glowing, and it's like Rumpelstiltskin was resurrected. And he heard the wish, and now he's trying to grant the wish. So he creates this illusion of her deceased husband, and they spend the night together, and then in the morning she just thinks that she dreamt the whole night. Um, the rest of the whole movie is just basically, Rumpelstiltskin coming to get her, trying to get her baby, and she's just doing whatever she can to fight him off. So the woman's maiden name in this film was Shelley Miller. So essentially, she is the Miller's daughter, if you think about it. Um, and one of the major things I noticed in this film, comparing it to the Grimm's Brother version, was how much power she was given, right? So she was a single woman, tasked with raising a baby on her own. And for the most part, she was fighting Rumpelstiltskin on her own. I mean, if you watch the movie, there's some parts where, she's staying at a friend's house, and her friend kind of helps her, and unfortunately dies trying to help her. And then she, meets a guy while running away from Rumpelstiltskin, who joins her and helps her out a bit. But for the most part, it is her that defeats Rumpelstiltskin on her own. So that was one of the major things I noticed differently here. So going back to my question of what was the motive, why did Rumpelstiltskin want to steal babies? The major difference between the Grimm's brothers version and the movie Rumpelstiltskin, I mean, obviously besides the fact that one's intended for children and one's intended for a more adult audience, is that the question of why he wants the babies is answered. Rumpelstiltskin, in two parts of the movie, he mentions that he doesn't have a soul. In the beginning, once Shelly realizes that, Rumpelstiltskin's running around her house trying to kill her, she grabs a knife from her kitchen and shoves it into the top of his head. And Rumpelstiltskin just starts laughing. And he's like, you can't kill someone without a soul. Then later in the movie, Rumpelstiltskin does get hold of the baby briefly. The baby's name was Johnny. And while trying to soothe the baby, he tells him, it's okay, Johnny, sleep tight, and by morning, I'll have your soul. So that was his motive in the movie. He wanted to steal the baby's soul. So after spending a few weeks developing this paper and, reading what other authors had to say about, the story of Rumpelstiltskin and, comparing and contrasting the Grimm's Brothers versions against, the movie that I had seen, the 1995 horror film Rumpelstiltskin, I started to think, was Rumpelstiltskin ever really the bad guy here? I mean, like, yeah, he came back to collect babies, but weren't they promised to him? I mean, in the Grimm's Brothers version, the miller's daughter, was quick to take off her jewelry and give him that. That meant nothing to her. But then she promised him a baby that she didn't have, and she probably didn't think she was gonna have a baby. And then when she did have the baby and she fell in love with her baby, as most mothers do, Rumpelstiltskin came back to collect the baby that was owed to him that she promised him, and she was just like, no, So was he the bad guy there? And then in the version, the 1995 horror movie, he wasn't really wrong either. I mean, did the Miller's daughter, or I'm sorry, did Shelley Miller know that she was promising her baby to Rumpelstiltskin? No, she wasn't familiar with the tale. Um, but Rumpelstiltskin did give her, a night with her husband. He did give her a night where her husband can meet the baby. And although she thought that was an illusion and she thought, she dreamt the whole night, Rumpelstiltskin did essentially grant her wish. And what he wanted in return was a baby. So was he ever the bad guy, or was he just, a man of his word? He was collecting his debts. These were all things that were promised to him. Throughout the movie, Rumpelstiltskin's kind of funny, like he's laughing. He calls himself Uncle Rumpel, and he steals a cigar from an old man. He's like, oh well, yeah, it's just what I need, another bad habit. He looked scary, but was he the bad guy?
Here I come, little Johnny. Uncle Rumpel's on his way.